Hello, theory students. This is a video about your week 14 homework reading, which is about bilingualism, multilingualism, monolingualism in children, and all of the many different contexts we see these phenomena, right? And what the research has to say about this kind of bilingualism. And how that's going to apply to us in our young learner classrooms. So this reading was divided into different groups, and I'm going to just start with group one's reading. I'm going to kind of help you process that so you can better participate in the jigsaw reading next week. So group one, early infant bilingualism, and you were asked to read, in addition to 110, which is this page, which kind of introduces the subject in a general way, talking about the background and the literature that has covered these concepts. Early infant bilingualism is pages 111 to 113. Okay, so I'm going to go through this and help you to understand kind of paragraph by paragraph and the most important parts. Not all of the details, but just to help you get the main idea of what's being said here. Because what you're going to see, whether you're in group 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, is that, as usual, the research out there is going to be varied, and it's going to sometimes come to opposing results, right? So, but what that does for us is it gives us a bit more nuance. It helps us understand that, it's not a black and white world, and the future research is needed. So, for those of you who are interested in pursuing perhaps a PhD. All right. Jumping into group number 1, early infant bilingualism. So this first paragraph is talking about the idea of a balanced bilingualism, which means basically you're introduced to two languages at the same time. The child is getting two languages at the same time. So they'd be considered early balanced bilinguals. And here we get into some research that kind of contradicts or kind of agrees and extends the results of other research. So, for example, when we're talking, you can say they all agree that continued bilingual exposure during preschool years will generally lead to balanced bilingualism, but the time frames differ, right? So De Hauer in 1995 said that they need regular and continued exposure between birth and 2 years old, right? And then McLaughlin comes along and says, no, to be an early balanced bilingual, they need regular and continued exposure from birth to 3 years old. And Genesee and Nicolaitis said, all right, it's going to be from birth to 4 years old. Okay, so there is not really a solid agreement, but this gives you an idea of what it takes to be a balanced bilingual. So, for example, if any of you are married to an English speaker, or I don't know, a Spanish speaker or a Japanese speaker, your child's going to be a balanced bilingual if they get regular and continued exposure to both languages. But what you see later in this reading is that, that's not always the case, because they're not hearing the same information in both languages necessarily. So there will still be a dominant language for that child. Or maybe one language is used for talking about things around the house, and another language is used for talking about things outside the house. You don't know, like every family is different, but those are different kinds of bilinguals, is what that means. All right, so some of the processes of early infant bilingualism and how are they different from monolingual children? This is one of your guiding questions. So, early examples often come to us from researchers who are looking at their own children, which is interesting, right? And some researchers will say, you know, don't research your own kids. It's a little too close. You can't be, you know, unbiased. But it has been done. All right, so it was originally proposed based on Leopold, 1949, a few years ago, right? That infant bilinguals started with this monolingual stage of development. So they used to say, okay, first stage, you've got the unitary language system. So in the early stages, that child doesn't know they're using two languages. Everything kind of goes into the same system. They're just plugging in L1 and L2s in there into this great system, so they don't really distinguish as two different languages, right? That's the unitary language system. So, and this is a process that, you know, some people still believe, right? So here's a quote that tells you about this idea of the unitary language system. So it's the first stage is what they thought, right? The first stage of language acquisition for these infant bilinguals is they get words from both languages, right? And the bilingual child is kind of like the monolingual child. They're just using words from two languages, one system. And then in the second stage, the child starts to distinguish between two different lexicons. What's a lexicon? Well, you should know lexis, right? Lexis refers to vocabulary. So your lexicon is your entire knowledge of vocabulary, right? And it includes related vocabulary, synonyms, all that stuff. So the lexicon, or the entire collection of vocabulary, in the second stage, there's two of them, you know. So for example, there's a Korean lexicon and an English lexicon for that child. But the syntax in this second stage is the same. So there's one syntax, one syntactic set of syntax. Syntax, of course, is your things like word order and sentence level grammar, right? That's syntax. So take, for example, you have vocabulary in English, vocabulary in Korean, but the child, for some reason, is using English syntax for everything. So English word order for everything. So 나는 좋아요 엄마, right? So we're gonna go Korean Lexis, Korean Lexis, Korean Lexis in English word order. Okay, so that was the second stage according to that. And the third stage, it's completely distinguished, right? So you've got the L1 and the L2 just like adults, and they know the difference. So this is what, when we talk about the unitary language system hypothesis, that's what it was talking about. So right in the next paragraph, and I know this is going to annoy some of you, but right in the next paragraph, they're saying, look, more recent research says bilinguals acquire separate language-specific properties early on. In other words, they kind of know the difference early on. Who says that? De Hauer, 95. Paradis and Genesi, 96. And then Borsch and Sebastian Gallet in 97. They show that 4-month-old infants could already discriminate between their two languages. 4 months. 4 months. and they know daddy's speaking English, mommy's speaking Korean. Well, of course, the languages in question were Catalan and Spanish, but they already knew. So infants at an early age can also tell, according to some research, the difference between languages that are familiar and languages that are not. Remember a few weeks ago, there was the video about, the TED Talk about how what infants are doing is they're running statistics, and when they're early, very, very young, they kind of have access to all the world's languages, which is pretty cool. So this is just saying that they can distinguish at a very early age. And here's a quote from Genesee. The infant's ability to distinguish a familiar, previously heard language from an unfamiliar foreign language implies that they have formed a neural representation of the familiar language, which is a template against which they can test other languages. What does that mean? That means that they know that other languages are out there even as an infant. They know that they recognize that this is a language that is not my language, but it is a language. So that's something interesting about bilingual infants' abilities. So other studies suggest that, some of the areas of development may be interdependent, so depend on each other, depend on the other language. So Grosjean in 94 suggested that there's an integrated model involving both independence and interdependence between the two language systems. So, in other words, what they're suggesting here is that there's two language systems, sometimes independent of each other, but sometimes depend on each other, sometimes interdependent. Paradis in 2001 was looking at French and English bilingual children, and said that there is some structural overlap because the perceived ambiguity in the input plays a role in language transfer. So let's break that down. Perceived ambiguity in the input, what does that suggest? It suggests that the child maybe doesn't always know if the input is coming in French or coming in English, right? So they don't know necessarily, they're not necessarily making that distinction. And so there's going to be structural overlap. So the structure, the syntax might overlap a bit. And that leads to language transfer. In other words, you're speaking in English and the French words are coming out, or you're using French syntax with English words, right? But that transfer is temporary according to this, and it only affects specific areas. And in other areas, the same people are saying the grammar is intact in both languages. And something interesting from Patterson and Pearson is that it seems like bilingual children are producing their first words at around the same age, around the same time as monolingual children, and the rate of vocabulary development is pretty much the same as monolinguals if you consider the combined bilingual lexicon. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if you're looking at only English, or you're looking at only Korean in a bilingual child, then you might say, okay, monolingual Korean child knows more Korean words. Fine. But if you include the English words, that bilingual child knows about the same as number of words as the monolingual Korean child. And bilingual children produce translation equivalents from the time they begin to speak. So by the age of a year and a half, the percentage of translation equivalents in bilingual children's vocabulary increases sharply, showing that from this age onwards, they definitely operate two distinct lexical systems. Okay, translation equivalents, they know it in both languages, they know the translation, they know the equivalent. Nicolaitis and Genesee argue that hearing parents talking, now this is important, right? Hearing parents talking about the same content in two different languages can help them develop an early awareness of translation equivalence, an early awareness of that word in both languages. So let's think about that. Like, is that going to happen in every bilingual family, in every bicultural family? Are the parents going to be talking about the same content in two languages? So that's something to keep in mind if you're interested in raising your own children to be these, superhuman balanced bilinguals. Because, often what happens is, even if one parent is speaking one language and the other parent's speaking the other language, they're talking about different things, right? Dad's talking about your grades in English because that's what he's interested in. Mom's talking about food and what did you eat today in Korean because that's what she's interested in. Something to think about. Okay, Nicolaitis and Genesee, bilingual children exhibit the same rate of morphosyntactic development as monolinguals, at least in their dominant language. What is morphosyntax or morphosyntactic development? That's the development of their own grammar and syntax. Okay, their own system of morphology, their system of syntax, right? Which is, again, grammar and word order and sentence level grammar. So it's not any slower. If you look at their dominant language, it's not any slower than monolingual peers. Why is this important for teachers? Why is this important for us? Because one of the biggest arguments that you will always hear when people are opposed to bilingual education is they'll say, no, we shouldn't have our children lack their first language because we're forcing a second language on them from an early age. And what this is saying is like, look, they're still developing at the same rate. Okay? Their morphosyntactic development in their dominant language, which is likely to be L1. If they're in Korea, it's likely to be Korean. So far, there's not a lot of evidence that says, oh, if you expose the child to English early, it's going to negatively impact their Korean. No evidence for that yet. Okay. And then Dopke found that Australian children learning English and German at the same time, they use verb-object word order much more in all verbal clauses in their German than did native monolingual German children. So they had, their dominant language morphosyntax was fine. It was really good. Okay. Early bilingual acquisition. Here's that Genesee quote. Although bilingual children are exposed to and must systematize two sets of language input, they appear to do so with about the same general time frame and approximately at the same ages as children learning only one language. This is the takeaway point, guys, that it's not going to slow you down. It won't slow the child down if they're learning two languages at once. The challenges of bilingual acquisition can be accommodated within the same temporal parameters. That's a fancy way of saying in the same amount of time as monolingual acquisition. Do not burden the child's mental capacities, leading to delays in development. And that's the biggest, again, the biggest reaction, the biggest, it's the biggest argument against early bilingual education, is that it's going to delay their development in L1. But as you can see, the evidence does not support that yet. And also, it's kind of interesting to think about it, that if children can do that, what else can they do? You know, if children can process 2 languages without it affecting their development, why not 3? Why not 4? Why not give them calculus when they're children? Well, maybe not calculus. Okay. A lot of researchers, this is getting into code mixing and what we call code switching. Okay, so code mixing is when you kind of use both languages in the same sentence. Code switching, English, 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 Korean, 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 English, English, Korean, Korean. Okay, so you go back and forth. Some early studies, early code mixing is grammatically constrained. So 2 grammatical systems are not violated in mixing. So that's pretty interesting. There's all these studies with these sets of languages. Bilingual children use code mixing to fill lexical and grammatical gaps. What does that mean? That means talking. I don't know this word in English, so I use the Korean. Talking. I don't know this grammar in English, so I use the Korean. Like that. Code mixing is context dependent, and so children use it in some contexts more than others. There's this study of English and Estonian. By the way, another country where I worked many years ago, Estonia, nice Baltic country. The Estonian language, guys, is really, really interesting. It's related to Finnish and Hungarian, and it sounds like, as one of my friends said, the language of elves. Like, mis on sinu lemmikvärv. That means what is your favorite color? Anyway, so Vichman in 98, looking at English and Estonian speaking children, showed that the presence of the parents and the recorder being there is going to change the code mixing behavior. So if mommy's in the room, you're going to speak differently. You could have said that yourself, right? Or if you know you're being recorded, you're going to behave differently. That's a phenomenon we know very well. And then Pan in 95 was talking about Mandarin and English speaking children, and Pan is not the first. Many studies out there talk about code switching and identity, right? The children tended to switch from Mandarin to English more than their parents, and that was because they're asserting their identity. They're aligning themselves with the outside culture, which in that context was the English-speaking culture. So they weren't asserting their Chinese-ness as much as they were asserting their, I don't know, American-ness or Canadian-ness, yeah? And so that's to do with identity. And children have also been shown to be experts at switching between languages to accommodate different interlocutors, right? Grandma's here, so we need to use Chinese now. Or, you know, my non-Chinese friend is here, so we switch over to English. The amount of code switching, blah, 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 It's related to their parents and other interlocutors' own language choices and code switching behaviors. That's important too. So you might have a parent that tolerates code mixing, and you might have a parent that discourages it. You know, if I had a child, I would definitely do that thing where, you know, I don't speak Korean. I would make the child speak English. And the reason you do that, of course, is as a parent you think this is going to lead to better English. And many parents have done this, as we're going to see later in the reading. This example from the study, English-Norwegian family. The 2-year-old mixed her languages more with Norwegian dad because the Norwegian father was using bilingual strategies and also, you know, using both languages. English-speaking mother would pretend she didn't understand Norwegian, and the child would use more English with her. So research just shows that code mixing happens. It can sometimes be influenced by the parents' behavior, what the parents will tolerate. And also you see these Camus, Genesia, and La Paquette found that when children are talking with an unfamiliar person, they're going to code mix about the same as that unfamiliar person. You don't want to be the weird person doing code mixing when other people are not. So when we talk about balanced bilinguals, as I was saying earlier, that indicates that children acquire both languages to the same level, but in reality, that doesn't usually, I mean, it's not that common. Like, it doesn't happen all the time. The majority of speakers end up with a dominant language, and that's okay. That's totally normal. Because it's not possible to have the same input in the same circumstances in both languages over a long period of time. Other factors could also play a part. The child might have contact with speakers of one of the languages regularly, but not with speakers of the other language, right? So that other language would be weaker. Other variables exist too. So as Baker suggests, what languages do the parents speak at home as their mother tongue, right? Parents L1 is going to make a difference even if parents using L2 with you. What languages do the parents speak to the child? Are they doing that thing where, oh, I don't understand Norwegian, right? What languages do other family members speak to the child? That's interesting too. Are they getting one language from family other than the parents? What languages does the child experience in the wider community? So take, for example, my situation. If I had a child here, you better believe that child would understand and speak English, but that child would also understand and speak Korean. And out there in the world, we're in Korea, people using Korean, she has, or he would have grandparents right down the street using Korean, right? But then if the child goes to an international school, there'd be, English. So it's interesting to think about, right? So this was the Group 1 reading, and I'll be back for Group 2 shortly.